anything. So good evening, everyone. I think we're all connected to audio at this point. So I will say hello and welcome. My name is Ginny, and I'm with Anderson's Bookshop. I'd like to welcome you to this virtual author event tonight with Patrick Radden Keefe in conversation with Alec MacGinnis. We're really glad to have our authors with us tonight, as well as all of you joining us. Thank you for taking the time to keep your eyes on another screen to talk books with us. For those of you who aren't familiar, Anderson's is an independent bookstore. We have been owned and run by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations now. So your support is very personal to us. It's very much appreciated. We just like to take a minute to say thank you for that. Obviously, this is a tough time for a lot of small businesses, and we're grateful for your support. Normally, we would be welcoming Patrick and hopefully Alec in person. A normal year when we would do over 400 in-person events, but hopefully this virtual style will keep us tied over until that time, which I hope is soon. I feel like we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, that we can be together again. We're getting there, but go out and get your vaccines, everybody, as soon as you can. Just a quick commercial. We do have lots of other events going on, virtual events for all ages, interests, and topics. So do check out our website, andersonsbookshop.com, or any of our various social medias to find your next one. Just a couple of things we have coming up. Tomorrow is Nigella Lawson. We have Renee Erickson coming up. And actually just announced was Peter Wohleman in conversation with Dr. Jane Goodall. He wrote The Heartbeat of Trees is his new book. So very excited about those upcoming events as well. But tonight, we are very happy to be celebrating the release of Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker. His other most recent books, the New York Times bestseller, Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, was selected as one of the 10 best books of 2019 by the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, our very own Chicago Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal, and was named one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the decade by Entertainment Weekly. That's quite an award from them. His previous books are The Snakehead and Chatter. His work has been recognized with the Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Magazine Award for Feature Writing, and the Orwell Prize for Political Writing. He's also the creator and host of the 8-part podcast, Wind of Change. So welcome, Patrick.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Our conversation partner tonight is Alec MacGinnis, who is a reporter for ProPublica and the author of the recently released Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. I'm going to put links to his books as well in the chat in just a moment here, in case you're interested in that, which you really should be. He has worked previously at the Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, and the New Republic, and his journalism has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and other publications. He's the recipient of the George Polk Award, the Robin Toner Prize, and other honors. His ProPublica reporting on Dayton, Ohio was the basis of a PBS Frontline documentary about the city, and he is also the author of The Cynic, a 2014 biography of Mitch McConnell, which is interesting in all its own ways as well. So welcome to you, Alec, and thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks.
I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and we're going to talk about this really interesting new book.
All right. Well, I'll start off. I just want to say something a little bit quickly about the book before I ask Patrick some questions. The subject of the opioid epidemic is something that I have been known very sort of intimately and closely through, 20 years now as a reporter. And I watched this starting in Baltimore when I was at the Baltimore Sun in 2003 and 4, covering the opioid issues and talking to people outside needle exchange vans in Baltimore, in Southwest Baltimore. I remember one couple still, this very young couple that had come in from Western Maryland after getting hooked on pills. They called themselves Cocoa and Pebbles, and there they were outside the needle exchange van, and they were utterly desperate. And they were in their early 20s, and things were already very bleak. I saw it in Ohio, Southeast Ohio, sitting in a drug court with people who were all in drug court because of opioids, pretty much. I saw it in Southwest Ohio at a family support meeting. A lot of broken families just coming together to talk about how to move on from that devastation. Saw it in Southern West Virginia at I remember a meeting with Joe Manchin, actually, who had come out for a community meeting with voters, and all anyone wanted to talk about were the pill mills that were just wreaking havoc in their towns. And so I've seen it through these last 20 years, basically, and it's pretty much almost everywhere I've gone as a reporter. And it's been so upsetting to watch it all happening. And I was so heartened a few years ago when Patrick took this on in his piece for the New Yorker. He did an amazing piece that an initial look at this one company, this one family, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, that was behind OxyContin. And I knew was vaguely aware of all these connections, but to see it pulled together in that piece was incredibly powerful. And I thought just nailed it in a way that no other piece had done to that point. And then when I saw that he was going to take it on in book form, I was even, just incredibly gratified and hopeful, because I knew it needed to be done, and I knew there was no one better suited to do it. And I've been reading it this past week, and it's extraordinary, and it's gripping, and it's infuriating, and it's so well done. Like it just nails it. So really, glad to be able to be part of this. I guess I would just start out, Patrick, by asking how you did come to this subject, a few years ago, after you wrote, this great book on Northern Ireland, and then what occasioned the turn to this subject?
Thank you. Let me just say, as a preliminary matter, thank you, Ginny and Andersons for hosting this, and thank you so much, Alec, for doing this. We don't know each other apart from over Twitter, but I've been a huge admirer of yours for so long, and it felt especially greedy of me to ask you to be an interlocutor this evening, given that you have your own book that you're out promoting, which I have right here, which I've been reading, which has really blown me away. Fulfillment, and interestingly, Fulfillment, a book, a very different sort of book, but a book about a company and its legacy and the impact that it's had around the country, and the kind of dissonance between one version of the kind of sort of public image of the consumer experience of that company, and then all of its many, many discontents. And so I actually think there's sort of interesting parallels between these books and their DNA, and hopefully we can talk about that. One other little preliminary, just to tell you all, by way of full disclosure, because life is never simple, I was diagnosed with COVID on Monday. I'm fine. I had already had one shot. It's a very mild case, but if I suddenly start wheezing and hacking, that's why. And I hope you'll forgive me. I'll try and mute myself if I feel anything too tempestuous coming. So how did I get into this? Unlike you, I had not followed this story for decades. I mean, I was ambiently aware that there was an opioid crisis, but I've always been very interested in drugs and in drug prohibition, and in the kind of all of the different embedded hypocrisies in the way in which the United States treats licit and illicit drugs. Yeah. And that's, it's an issue that I've kind of approached from different angles, but I spent almost a decade ago now, I spent quite a bit of time looking at Mexican drug syndicates and the ways in which drug prohibition had created this huge kind of transnational commodities business, which I was really chiefly interested in as a business. I mean, these are, on the one hand, these kind of criminal organizations with gangs of assassins that behead people. And I think that aspect of the story tends to kind of dominate the narco narrative. What I was really interested in was, how do they function as businesses? How is it that they're kind of vertically integrated, they're diversified in terms of their product lines, they're incredibly sophisticated in their ability to export drugs to a pretty insatiable market in the United States, and then take a lot of American money and launder it. And, their weapons all come from our country. So they do this kind of this sort of regulatory arbitrage across the border. And at a certain point, I became aware that these cartels are very sensitive to consumer demand. I had become really interested in the point where they decided that like meth was the future.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point, the story started to change, and it became a story about Mexican heroin. And Mexican heroin was really flooding across the border into the US in ways that were confusing to me initially. And when I started looking into it, I very quickly realized that there was an existing market in this country of people who hadn't started out using heroin. They had started out using prescription pills. and for a variety of reasons had ended up graduating to heroin. And the cartels very cleverly saw this as an opportunity, and sort of started moving in that direction. And that pretty quickly led me to Purdue Pharma, the role it had played in the opioid crisis, and to the Sackler family. And the Sacklers at that point had been written about before. Barry Meyer, the New York Times reporter, published a book in 2003 in which he talked briefly about them. Mm-hmm. Sam Quinones had written a great book, Dreamland, that described some of the family history. But nobody had ever told a story in which the family was the focus,
right?
Was center stage. And so that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah. So the family, I mean, the story of the family is just incredible in this book. And it also, it's so comprehensive. It's the story of this, really the dynasty from the start of a striving, immigrant family in the early 20th century. And then this, arc of just the striving, the aspiring, and the wealth, but it's also, it taught me, it was revelatory for me, because I think to the extent that I've been following all this, and that the families now fall in disgrace and in ignominy, I had sort of picked up on this notion of the kind of the good Sacklers and the bad Sacklers. There was this notion that you've had a couple of branches of the family, and you have a whole bunch of Sacklers saying, OxyContin's not us. We don't have to take our names off of these museums and universities and whatnot, because that money came from Arthur Sackler. He was a good Sackler. He predated OxyContin. And that's been sort of something that's been out there, that notion of these two branches, and one being somehow more innocent than the other. But you read the book and you see how so much of this in fact goes back to Arthur Sackler, and because he was the pioneer in this incredible realm of medical advertising, pushing medications on Americans that they don't even know that they even need necessarily, and making tons of money off of Librium and Valium, and just showing just how much wealth can be made out of these kinds of drugs, and then just showing how much advertising matters and pushing things on the consumer matters, and also just all sorts of evasions of regulatory evasions and whatnot that he was already doing well before we got to OxyContin. So do you see, I'm just curious if you see, I mean, obviously you want to tell a story in full because it's the entire family, but do you actually see the branches actually being much closer, and do you really see somehow what happened with OxyContin in fact being based in what happened before it, and that this being kind of a continuous strain of behavior and ethics and a style of business, so that it really is more appropriate to think of them all together as a single family with a very kind of continuous approach to making money and selling drugs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I just, by way of background for those who aren't familiar with the story, there are originally three Sackler brothers: Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond, and they grow up in Brooklyn, the children of immigrants during the Great Depression. They're Jewish, and they experience terrible anti-Semitism. They all become physicians, and they're very ambitious and entrepreneurial, and so they're in medical practice, but also starting businesses left and right. And Arthur Sackler ends up dying in 1987, prior to the release of OxyContin. And so there's this question of, why would I devote a third of the book to this guy? So one answer would be that the book is not just a book about OxyContin and the opioid crisis. I was interested in kind of telling a bigger sort of family saga story. But, if I'm trying to think of the right analogy here. There are a couple of Koch brothers who people aren't referring to when they talk about the Koch brothers. And apart from, a few kind of minor notes in passing, somebody like Jane Mayer is not going to give equal time to the Koch brother who just like buys castles in Europe,
Right.
Or the one who collects wine in Florida. The choice for me to spend so much time focusing on Arthur was very much driven by a conviction that he was actually the kind of chief protean originator of so many of the innovations that we later see in practice. It's almost a cliche of, you know, any sort of family dynasty story that you start with this kind of font of originality and charisma and ambition, and then slowly each subsequent generation is like a not great carbon copy of the one that came before, and the quality continues to erode. There's a little bit of truth in that in this story, in the sense that Arthur Sackler is a pioneer. You know, I interviewed all these old guys in their 90s who were in the medical advertising field in the 1950s. And they said, this guy invented the wheel. He invented the whole business as we know it today. You know, his intuition that it's actually not the consumer that is most important to reach, it's the doctor. You need to know the doctor. And the way to trick a doctor is by using other doctors. And so, you know, you enlist other medical professionals. Sometimes he would literally make them up. I describe in the book an advertisement that has a bunch of business cards of doctors who supposedly vouch for one of his drugs, and it turns out they don't exist. They're made up. A journalist tried to call them, and they were big numbers. Right. But also the kind of regulatory capture. There's a story I tell in the book about effectively the bribery of the top FDA official in charge of antibiotics in the late 1950s, which Arthur Sackler was involved in. There's a moment where, you know, a lot of what I'm trying to get at in the book, which isn't even just about pharmaceuticals per se, but it's more about the way a certain type of elite player is able to evade accountability over long periods of time. And when the US Senate starts investigating Arthur Sackler, he lawyers up, he gets Clark Clifford, who's like the power lawyer of his day, to come and represent him. And he basically snows this congressional committee and ends up sort of dancing free. All of these things that you see in Arthur's story, you see subsequently repeated in the story of the subsequent Sacklers and OxyContin.
Right. You mentioned the doctors. I mean, one of the things I found so repeatedly cynical and upsetting was their defense that when you would challenge them about when people would challenge them about this promotion through doctors and all the, you know, the free dinners for doctors and all the blandishments for doctors to get them to sell the stuff, to buy the stuff, for prescribe the stuff, whether it's Valium or then OxyContin. This line that, well, how dare you suggest that doctors can be easily bought? Doctors they're physicians. They're scientists. This is not how they function. When everything they were doing was suggested that they thought otherwise, that they had millions of dollars budgeted for this purpose. Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is very much Arthur's line was always that the physicians are unimpeachable. That he said, you know, it's not advertising, it's just education. We're not trying to, you know, to influence anyone. There's literally a period of time, quite a long period of time, where Arthur, he publishes a free medical newspaper. His name is nowhere on the masthead. It's not acknowledged that he has pharmaceutical interests. He publishes all this editorial content that's favorable to pharmaceutical companies. And then all of the advertising is advertising for companies that are clients of his. And it was amazing for me, of course, I went to the College of Physicians in Philadelphia, where they have a pretty good run of the Medical Tribune. And you turn these pages, and it's one of those funny things where I now know, like telescoping backwards from the 21st century, I can flip through these pages and it's just like one conflict of interest after another. But at the time, the million plus physicians who got this newspaper for free were none the wiser.
Right, exactly. So then we move ahead to OxyContin in the 90s, and the line that they start using then in their defense is even more gobsmackingly cynical and just astonishing, and which is, yes, yes, it turns out that, oh my gosh, who knew that this pill can be abused, but it's being abused only by this sort of criminal class of inveterate, longtime drug abusers who are always looking for their fix, and now they found a fix with this thing, but they're a bunch of ne'er-do-well lowlifes, and we shouldn't limit the drug unnecessarily for all the people who really need it, the real patients. That becomes the standard line, and it's so breathtakingly cynical because they know, they must know that the incredible numbers they're getting from these various practices out in West Virginia and Kentucky and elsewhere from specific doctors, huge sales numbers, are precisely because they're selling to people who are in fact abusing, and I just wonder, reading it, you can't understand like how they got away with that line, and that when they must have known full well that they're getting these great sales numbers from precisely the misuse and abuse. And they as you point out, they have the actual, like, they have a separate company that has data that tracks the sales. They know all these sales, they know where they are, and yet somehow they're able to claim that it's not that it's the abusers who are a problem, when in fact the abusers are driving these extraordinary sales. That is what's behind these incredible numbers that are coming out of a lot of these towns and clinics.
Yeah, it's funny, it's still a little bit of a mystery to me, in the sense that you're right. So you're pointing to kind of two different things that are related. The first is that they sort of posit this typology. And I should say, I mean, privately, and I know this because I've read their private emails, some of the Sacklers still cling to this even today. They've somewhat calibrated their public stance, but privately, some of them still talk this way. The idea, Richard Sackler, who's his second generation Sackler, very intimately involved with the development of OxyContin, running the company in the 1990s. He was the one who really sort of articulated this idea that you have legitimate pain patients, and then you have, his word was, scum of the earth, drug abusers, a criminal element, and they're not victims. And he would say these really amazing things when he would say things like, they want to get addicted. They do it on purpose to themselves. But then there's this kind of more subtle point that you're getting at, which is that they also know virtually in real time where all the pills are getting prescribed. And it is a feature that we now understand of OxyContin, that, you'd get some dodgy doctor in some rural community in Appalachia who's like prescribing crazy amounts of OxyContin that are just like way out of proportion with the size of the local population. And what Purdue would say is, well, look, it's not for us to judge how a doctor practices medicine. All we see is those numbers. For all we know, there's some particular nuance there, and they would never shut these doctors down. And so the thing that is to me so galling is that on the one hand, you're demonizing the people who, supposedly are willfully abusing your product. I mean, again, I think that distinction turns out to be BS. It turns out that lots and lots of people actually are pain patients who are prescribed OxyContin by a doctor and just become addicted. They're not doing this of their own volition. It's a sort of accidental addiction situation. I cite a statistic in the book, which is a new statistic from United Health, the big insurer. They did a study of their own patients, looking at patients who were prescribed OxyContin by a doctor and then subsequently diagnosed with an opioid use disorder. They ran this study recently, and this is one insurer, and they said that the hits came back on the Venn diagram in the hundreds of thousands. Wow. So, the notion that as the Sackler's representatives continue to maintain, it is vanishingly rare for people to become addicted when they take it properly in a doctor's care is silly. But the thing that's so striking to me is they going back to my interest in like licit and illicit drugs,
Mhm.
there was no way not to know that the so-called abusers were driving your profits.
Exactly.
So there was a thriving black market in OxyContin, but as I point out in the book, there was no black market manufacturing, right? Like
Right. It was all for you.
it was,
Right.
yeah. So it was all like the secondary market, but like they were getting paid for every one of those pills.
Right. Exactly. And so I mean, Richard Sackler is an extraordinary figure, and he comes through just, I mean, so starkly. The story of him as a young man, you know, obsessed with the orgasm. So spends the entire summer with his college buddy doing research, serious research on the orgasm. I mean, and then finds his way into the family company, and becomes the driving force behind OxyContin. I kept, as I was reading that whole, you know, his sell, you know, just pushing it so hard, wanting bigger and bigger numbers, even as all these signals are going off that the numbers are big for a reason, and it's not a good one. But still, just go after those doctors, go, you know, sell more to the ones that are clearly problems. I kept thinking of this phrase that one of the readers who responded to Fulfillment used the phrase. They were, you know, very upset about the book after having read the book and thinking about Amazon and this hugely dominant company that was getting bigger and bigger and richer, and a man who just made $60 billion this past year, Jeff Bezos, and the phrase this reader used was extreme greed, and how extreme greed kind of permeates, you know, our world. And I thought so much about that when I was reading about Richard Sackler, because it just seemed like this notion of just greed made manifest, like this desire, like a visceral desire for more. And we've become very sort of reluctant to talk about sort of terms like that, more in terms of basic, you know, morality, like greed, but is that at heart what lies at this when we get to that part of the story, or even earlier perhaps with Arthur, or is it something else? Like, you're trying to make sense of this family and how it got to that point where it was just sell more. Was it at heart greed?
So I think it was a cocktail of things, and I think that greed is a persistent component of that cocktail. And I agree, it's very extreme greed. I mean, OxyContin generated $35 billion in revenue over the decades. You know, we don't know exactly how much the Sacklers took out, or how much they have left. There were actually some documents released by the House Oversight Committee yesterday that suggest that their fortune today it's at least $11 billion.
Right. Yeah.
So I do think greed was a very important element, but it's funny you should mention Bezos, because, and not even necessarily to pick on him, because I think you might say the same for somebody like a Mark Zuckerberg. I think there's something else too, and I don't have a really, I sort of don't have my elevator pitch version of this yet, but if I could just let me talk it out, and you'll see what I'm getting at. There's a kind of stubbornness that Arthur Sackler had and that Richard Sackler has, and I actually think it's a very, very common family trait, where there's a sort of idealism at the outset, and a hubris, and also a kind of a sense that, like, there are some problems out there in the world that people have wrestled with and failed to crack, you know, for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, and I have cracked it. And going along with that, I actually think that there is a kind of intense, righteous sense of their own virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, so many of the really interesting kind of moral inflection points in this story are about what happens when the world comes back to you with data that shows that you're wrong, you know, that actually, like, you might have fucked up, you might have been careless, there might have been all kinds of unseen consequences for your actions. How do you then respond? And again and again and again over decades, the Sacklers would double down, double down, double down, never admit doubt, never have a moment where for a second they entertain the idea that they might not be the heroes of the story.
Right.
And weirdly, I actually think that that's a kind of, that's a sort of behavioral type that you see. I don't think Jeff Bezos sees himself as the villain in the story,
Right.
And so I think that there's this kind of desire to go out and change the world, to sort of to put a dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs said. And it's this kind of failure to be at all reflective about whether or not it's the right sort of dent.
Right. I was also thinking as I was reading it of your last book of Say Nothing, and because I saw a common desire on your part to basically call something for what it is, and basically kind of break through a kind of propriety around a given subject, where a lot of people have been kind of hush hush, and there's been a sense that you don't speak of that. You just don't really, you don't go there. Like you don't go there about Jerry Adams and G. McConville. Like you just kind of like, we know certain things happened, but it just, even as Jerry Adams rises and sort of gets somehow redeemed and is sort of made respectable, we're not going to talk about that stuff from back then. And you wrote a great book about the stuff from back then and just called things for what they were and did the reporting to show the connections. Similarly here, there was this sense all these years that a lot of the museums and people who kind of circled around the Sacklers and benefited from their wealth and took their money kind of vaguely were aware of where it all came from, but you didn't really talk about it. Like, so it wasn't, one learned to avoid the subject, and you don't go there. You don't really just say out loud what the money really came from and what it's really all about, and really draw the connections. And so in those books you've done that. And what I think is wonderful about it is that I feel like too often I think often as especially as journalists and as kind of wonk types, there's this tendency now to always think in terms of structural issues, the systemic, the structural. Everything can be explained with some kind of structural or systemic explanation. So say the opioid epidemic happened because of deindustrialization and because you had all these people who were without jobs and had bad backs and they got hooked. But actually, that's true, that there's a context. But actually what you show in your books is that there is still a story of personal choice and personal agency and personal morality, and families that decide, people that decide to make certain choices and behave in certain ways, and with huge consequences. And so I'm just curious why you're driven to actually tell that personal story of personal agency and choices and consequences, rather than being lost in the abstract of the structural and the systemic.
Yeah, I mean, boy, it's fascinating seeing you draw that connection between the two books. I hadn't really thought of it in that way, but you're right. And in some ways, I think of them as quite different projects because I mean, my sort of glib book tour talking point has been that the Say Nothing was very much for me a book that's kind of mired in moral ambiguity. And with this book, I felt a great deal of moral clarity on pretty much every page. But you're right. I mean, there are some similarities. In terms of it, I have this thing where I'm most comfortable writing about people and exploring issues through a kind of story of people in conflict making choices. And I'm very interested in systems and systemic issues. And I hope that, particularly to go back to what I was saying earlier about impunity and the way in which the Sacklers' money, you see it just kind of, in sort of insinuate itself into the medical establishment, universities, the art world, the FDA, the Department of Justice. It ends up kind of influencing everything to a point where by the end of the book, it should sort of be no surprise that they're not going to face really meaningful consequences for their actions. I'm definitely trying to make a deeper systemic point there.
Yes.
But I always prefer to do so through the prism of a fairly specific story, in part because I do think sometimes you need to be the skunk at the garden party and say the thing that people aren't saying. And it almost goes beyond, with the Sacklers, it goes beyond, it's like active suppression. I mean, there's a story I tell in the book about Tufts University, which subsequently became the first institution in this country to take down the Sackler name altogether. After medical students basically revolted and said, we don't want to go and learn to be doctors in a building named after this family. But after Sam Quinones's book Dreamland came out, there was a proposal at Tufts to put it on the list for incoming students. And it was quietly scuttled because the administration worried that this would be, a little awkward for their donors, the Sacklers. Imagine and think about that.
It's incredible. What, when it comes to, so much of this story, as the story moves on, is about philanthropy and all the conflicts, incredible conflicts within philanthropy. And it's something I get into in fulfillment, as well as Bezos and Amazon try to sort of move into, very belatedly kind of move into philanthropy as a way to sort of absolve themselves. What is your counter to those who say, who have said all these past few years, as this debate about the Sackler money has come up at the museums and the universities? Look, we all know that, what's the line? Behind every great fortune is a great crime. And in this case, it was this crime. In other cases, it's this or that industry that caused this or that depredation. This is what comes with the world of big giving, big money, and just reality. And so, what's the big deal? Essentially, are we going to start going after all these others too, these other donors as well, scrutinizing every jot of their source of wealth? What is your counter to that sort of rationalization of the money and the giving?
Well, I mean, I should say, I think it's a hugely complex issue from the point of view of these institutions. And I've heard pretty earnest arguments that I don't necessarily find self-serving from people saying, I'm happy to take money from bad people and spend it on good things. Thank you. I don't need you looking over my shoulder, passing judgment on whether or not the money stinks. If I spend it on something that is definitively a public good, then that's good enough for me. So I think this is a subject on which reasonable people can differ. I also am sympathetic to the institutions in the sense that it's certainly true, as somebody who works at the Met, said to me, like, look, okay, if the Sacklers come down and we're introducing a moral litmus test for our board, I mean, what about the Kochs, right? Like, where do you stop? And this fear that it would unravel, or that if you take names down today, then you may create fear among prospective donors that you're not going to honor their commitment. I think that the issue for me is, can you stand by the crime? And so I think the most telling thing for me is, in conversations with people who work at some of these institutions, a lot of the time there is a private acknowledgement that they already know. They find it distasteful. And I think what I find most, where I'm least sympathetic with them, is when they express the point of view that, yeah, we know, but we're just waiting for the PR to become unsustainable. Like, I think there's a kind of, at my most cynical, I worry that there is something systemic happening, and you see it in my book, though it's not quite as in focus as the impunity stuff is, which is that in the end, everything boils down to PR. I got this log of WhatsApp chats between descendants of Mortimer Sackler, where they're all talking about all kinds of different stuff. It's a private family log. and over more than a year, they talk about all this stuff. And in terms of the question of the company and the family and all that, it's all about PR. They're just like, oh, it's a bad narrative. How do we reverse the narrative? Like everything boils down to PR. I think for these institutions, it's the same way. So I actually think that I guess for me, it's one of those things where it's like, if you're okay with what the Sacklers have done and with the opioid crisis and with your institution being associated with hundreds of thousands of people who've died, if you're okay with Nan Golden showing up from time to time and having a protest to remind people about the origins of this money, then have at it. Yeah, keep the name up, do your thing.
Right.
But I think it's dismaying to me that I think the kinds of arguments that I just articulated and that you articulated, it's like I could see somebody making the argument earnestly, but I worry that a lot of the time I think they're just made opportunistically by people who are hoping that nobody will catch on.
Exactly, keep the money. Yeah.
So
one question we've gotten here relates to another, I think probably fairly common kind of counter you might get from readers, which is, has to do with the people who have legitimately benefited from advances in pain medication these last few decades, people who suffer from terrible pain and have, for whom some of these medications have been real lifesavers. And so one person with us tonight asks essentially just how much you, in your reporting, how much you reached out to sort of that whole realm of the hundreds of thousands of people who did have gotten some benefit from OxyContin or counterparts, just how much you tried to sort of talk to them, the people who, thank goodness, have for whom it did not end badly.
Sure, yeah, it's a great question, and believe me, I hear from pain patients all the time, often asking me to stop doing this reporting, out of a fear that the pendulum is swinging too far in the other direction. That kind of broadly speaking, in the 1990s, at the instigation of Purdue Pharma and other companies, there was much, much, much more prescribing and overprescribing of these types of drugs for lots and lots of people, many of whom didn't need them. And that what we've seen is then, after the opioid crisis, it kind of goes too far in the other direction, that people have trouble accessing their medications, that they are being tapered too aggressively by their doctors, that doctors worry too much about what the consequences for them could be of prescribing these types of medicines to people. And I'm very, very sensitive to these concerns. I've had many, many, many notes from people over the years, and I understand, I think, the experience of people who are suffering from terrible, terrible pain, and whose perspective is, these medicines have helped me, and I want to continue to have access. Here's where it gets tricky. I feel as though the concerns of precisely those types of patients have been very cynically exploited by Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers and other opioid makers over the decades. And you had a huge push, effectively, with OxyContin in particular, to get it out there prescribed not just for people with severe chronic pain, but with moderate pain. And this is part of what gave us the opioid crisis. And at each juncture along the road where anyone, whether it's the press or a regulator or Congress or federal investigators, starts to look into what's happening at Purdue and say, God, is there overprescription? Are people abusing this drug? Are they getting addicted? What Purdue and the Sacklers would say was, but what about the pain patients? We need to think about access for the pain patients. The irony, of course, being that we end up in this place where we are today, where because of the rampant overprescription of the drugs, it actually does get much, much harder for some people who need them to be sure that they will have continued access. So I think these are very, very hard issues. I will say, I don't know what the tenor of the question was, but occasionally people will say to me, stop writing about this. Stop demonizing the Sacklers because you're making it harder for me. And I have to say, just in terms of my, my prerogatives as a journalist, everything in the book is factual. It's scrupulously endnoted. You can check everything there. I don't think any of the things that I'm saying about the Sacklers are not either, they're factual, fair, and warranted. I don't think that there will be unintended consequences of this type of reporting. And certainly the last thing I want to do is stigmatize anybody who uses these drugs, frankly, legally or illegally. But I also worry sometimes because the tenor of some of these notes I get are, I'm not a drug addict, I'm not a drug abuser, I'm not a criminal, I'm doing this right. Why are these other people making it hard for those of us who are patients? And again, because of the number of people who have, in a doctor's care, become addicted to OxyContin, that's a kind of a that's a framework that I'm a little uncomfortable with.
Yeah. Someone else asks, and this kind of leads into something I wanted to ask you. In researching for the book, did you find any Sackler relatives who expressed regrets in the part that their family played in the crisis? And that gets sort of at the bigger question of now sort of the reckoning and the legacy, and essentially, how to put this, is there a sense among some of the family that it absolutely was not worth it, and that while now there's this extraordinary wealth that still remains with the family, still billions with the family, that it's all just been a complete fiasco and disgrace that will stay with them forever? Or do you get the sense that some people in the family still kind of see this as a cost to be born, but so we're going to lose a few millions of the fortune, but we still are fabulously wealthy, and we're going to carry on in the world with the yachts and the mansions and whatnot, and it's just in a way the cost of doing business? Or do they actually feel this reckoning very deeply to the point where they find it just horrifying and something that they deeply regret?
Okay, so there's a few different things going on there.
Yeah.
And I should say up front, I didn't speak with any of the Sacklers,
Right.
but I did speak with the great many people who know them, and I managed to obtain a lot of their private correspondence. So it's a weird thing where I didn't talk to them. They were very antagonistic about the book and me doing the book. And yet the book is largely written using their own words. I kept thinking I would find some Sackler who had big misgivings.
Yeah.
Either somebody who was involved in the company on the board, or I thought more likely some third generation Sackler who has grown up, is worth, hundreds of millions of dollars. A lot of them they're like indie filmmakers,
right,
and coders, and they do all kinds of things that aren't being involved in the opioid business.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that there'd be some hip, young, kind of socially conscious Sackler who said, you know what, I don't want the money, or I'm going to take my trust and I'm going to devote the whole thing to harm reduction and abatement and treatment.
Mm-hmm.
That has not happened. I could not find a single Sackler who would express any view that was contrary to the family line of the Raymond and Mortimer wings.
Right.
And their feeling is, we have done nothing but good for the world. This is a false PR narrative. It's a false media narrative. The 49 states that are suing our company,
yeah,
the 25 states that are suing our family, all the books that have been written, the journalists, the congressional investigations, I think there's 2,500 lawsuits against the company now. They're all wrong.
Right.
We're right. We never did anything wrong. We're just terribly misunderstood. And I think that tends to be the kind of prevailing orthodoxy within the family. And to me, this psychologically, this is super interesting. Trying to kind of figure out, like, how could you be so blind as to persist in that kind of assumption?
It's why the book's so important. I mean, really, it's in a way, it's accountability. I mean, the accountability is so necessary, especially necessary because of that mindset. And in a way, it's almost like it's almost for them. Like, in a sense, it's almost something. It's for them to have it all. If any of them can bring themselves to read it, to say, here it is. It's all just there, and it's why it's so important also that the book is written with such steadiness, and it's so just solid and understated, and there's nothing gratuitous. It's just on this nice slow burn, you get angry reading it but it's all just the accumulated details. There's nothing that just sort of, you're not trying to hit anyone over the head with it. It's the accretion of all this just what you see is just this ethical kind of degradation and the greed again, but it's all just in the story. And so
I'm glad you say that. I mean, because I thought a lot about kind of tone and voice as I was writing, and I just felt as though it would be a mistake to put too much, to put spin on the ball.
Right. No, that's what makes it so powerful. It's all just in the details. Is it strange at all for you now to watch this moment now where pharma has been kind of exalted again, and they're great heroes again, and of course, these other companies are not Purdue. Purdue was very much, just what you described them doing was something that was happening at Purdue, at these buildings with Richard Sackler, and it was just horrifying. And we have to keep in mind that was them. But many of the things that they did are shared by the other companies. The selling, all that. Is it weird at all for you to see this hero moment now for pharma?
It's not something I've actually given all that much thought to until people started reading the book. And there are some sections early on in the book about Pfizer and some really dishonest stuff, including bribing an FDA official that Arthur Sackler was involved in. Pfizer was his client. Maybe I'm just so out of it that I didn't kind of make the connection, but having just gotten the Pfizer shot myself, I started hearing from people saying, my God, the bloom is, I've been so thankful to Pfizer. Pfizer's been in a way, this goes back actually to the question from the person who was asking about pain patients.
Yeah.
I'm not a prohibitionist.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be the first to acknowledge that these, OxyContin is a miraculous drug. I mean, that the level of innovation by these companies is really extraordinary. And I think it's possible to tell a story about some of the kind of ethical hazards of the industry and the ways in which there are tremendous unintended consequences for this kind of thing, that doesn't deny or suppress the idea that they have these incredible innovations. So I think part of the frustration for me is, and this is why it all comes back to Arthur Sackler, right? Yeah. Is it's like there's the innovation itself, and then there's how you market it, and how you advertise it, and the claims that you make. And the how you deal with the fact that there are side effects and there are risks. The answer for me is not that you don't make the drugs, you don't sell the drugs. It's about how you position them in the marketplace, and with doctors and prescribers. So I feel as though it's possible to keep these two ideas in one's head, but I also think that when you look at the world of vaccines and pricing and who gets what when, there's almost no story you could tell me about where we'll be in 18 months that would be too cynical for me to believe.
Right. Someone else is asking, I think questions on a lot of people's minds, given just how damning the book is and as an account, and just how devastating in its totality. how worried are you that they would actually come after you in the form of, some kind of suit? I mean, some kind of legal action. The book is so incredibly researched and footnoted that it's rock solid. But how much has that been hanging out there as a prospect? All I've had to worry about so far from Amazon was a letter to the editor attacking me from Jay Kearney.
The best publicity you could ask for. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah. That took a month. I was starting to worry that I was, what was wrong with me? Nothing. That there I was 1 month in. But what have you, what rumblings have there been from their Aries?
So they've been pretty quiet the last 10 days or so. They've certainly, perhaps they're reading. They've been threatening to sue me for 2 years. They went through a whole process of having a lawyer send me what's called a litigation hold, where I'm supposed to kind of not destroy any of my documents or notes, because that could be evidence in the eventual lawsuit and so forth. I would be naive not to be prepared for that possibility. It is also true that they have threatened to sue journalists for 20 years and they've never actually sued. And that if they were to sue, it would be bad for them if they sue. I mean, ironically, it would be bad for them and probably good for me, in the sense that I'm a pretty open book. If I was forced in discovery to I wouldn't disclose my sources, but if I were sort of forced to show you even more about the mechanics of the book than you can glean in the back matter, I feel like I'd come out of that smelling pretty good. And discovery works both ways, right? So I would have to also get discovery on them to get to the truth of whatever the assertions in question are. If they actually brought a suit, they would almost certainly lose, and it would probably whip up a huge amount of publicity of the sort that they don't want, and it would be great for sales of the book. I think probably if their lawyers are being honest with them, they would talk about it. And as much as it might be tempting to retaliate in some manner, I think that would be probably it would be like a level of irrational that that even for them might be a bit much. But hey, I certainly wouldn't put it past them. I'm certainly ready for that if it happens. Doubleday, my publisher, from the very beginning has been prepared for that as an eventuality, should that happen. And so we'll see. I certainly can't rule that.
Yeah. I guess my last question for the evening would be something I thought about a lot as I was reading it, partly because I've just come out of writing Fulfillment, and Fulfillment was in its own way, it's kind of the story of these last few decades told through one frame, which is these incredible disparities that have opened up around the country. And I sort of tell that story through the frame of this one company. And I kept thinking, as I was reading Empire of Pain, of how they mapped on each other in a way, because it was like what you were describing was OxyContin taking hold in so many of the places that were that were the left behind places, and that there was that whole same geography, and it was just coming at it from this other company that was profiting massively from those regions while the sort of collapse was happening. So I wonder, is Empire of Pain also essentially a story of these last few decades and what's happened to us? Or does one have to be careful about that, because then it risks becoming just about the sort of the vulnerability and the needs and that were in these places that led people to the medication in the first place, and you lose sight of the culpability and again the sort of choices of the people doing the selling. But how much do you think of this really as a story of in a way of our unraveling these last few decades?
I mean, I think it can be both. I think that you can acknowledge that there are a series of systemic factors in play in a way that doesn't absolve anyone from individual agency. I do think that when it's funny, you talk in your book about deaths of despair, and that's a fascinating concept, right? Because I think as a kind of descriptive concept, it's very powerful. It's also the sort of concept that people like the Sacklers love, right? Because their idea is, oh, look, there are these very complex sort of societal things going on that have nothing to do with us, and the decisions we made. And if you see an uptick in overdoses and addiction and so forth, that's related to suicide, it's related to unemployment, and so on and so forth. I think both can be true. To me, I do see these very strong parallels between our books, and for me, it's partially the idea. I mean, you take a more explicitly regional approach in your book, but there's this motif that keeps coming back in my book about kind of who cleans up the mess, you have an employee at Purdue who starts taking OxyContin and becomes addicted, and she's been working for the company for 20 years, and they say, put your shit in the box and get out of here.
It's an incredible story.
You have a resort where Mortimer Sackler Jr. goes to vacation with his family in the Turks and Caicos. And I learned this story from a yoga instructor who was flown in, that one of the issues they have at the resort is that migrants from Haiti sometimes get on little boats, and try and get to Turks, and they wash ashore dead. And at the resort, they realized that it was really unseemly for the people who stay at the resort to have to wake up and see the body of a dead migrant on the beach. So they have somebody who sits out at night scanning the beach, so that if a body washes up, they can get it out of there before any of the wealthy clients wake up. And it's this idea of kind of you get these elites who live in these kind of bubbles, right, and are incredibly insulated from the downstream costs of all of the systems that allow them to persist in the lives that they have become so comfortable with. And to me, that's something I saw again and again in your book, and I feel as though it's like this thread that runs straight through mine.
Right. Yeah, it's what I've tried to do all these years, is make those connections. I think that's what we all try to do, is trying to draw that line from up here to down there.
Right. And the thing is, it's often so much shorter than people might think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think we're at a kind of a natural pausing point. There we go. I get my screen figured out here. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. That is incredibly fascinating and disturbing, and important all at the same time. And I think is the right way to get to a more educated society and the impacts of all of this, to discuss these things out in the open. So I thank you both for your reporting and your writing and your honesty in showing us all of these things, so that we can kind of try and make it better. I find it fascinating and somehow unsurprising that you couldn't find a single Sackler, Patrick, who was not part of all of this. It's very telling indeed. So thank you so much for both of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules, I know, to be with us tonight. And thank you to all of you who have joined us as well. If you did order a copy of the book as part of your ticket, then you will get an email from Event Combo via Event Combo from us, letting you know when that's ready to pick up or be shipped out. And if you have not yet picked up a copy, I just dropped links in the chat for both the new book from Patrick and the newest book from Alec, which clearly need to be read together. This is an excellent pairing that way, so that you can grab your copies there not from Amazon. Alec, thank you for that. You read a book about the danger Amazon is doing.
You will truly, if you read this book, you will never order from Amazon again.
Well, we here at Anderson's are all about that. So let's support our local actual communities where we are, and the people in those communities. So and help keep them safe from places like pharma, like Purdue. So anyway, thank you both of you for being here. It's really been fascinating. I appreciate it. And to everybody else, thank you. Be safe and happy reading.
Thank you.
All right, Patrick, get well soon. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right. Be well, guys. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah, sure.